Hello, everyone. Welcome to week 5, where we will be discussing chapter 9. You'll notice on the syllabus that this week is sort of labeled as focusing more on adolescent services, whereas the chapter in the textbook is really specific to school-based services. We will cover more general adolescent topics throughout the module, but the textbook really does focus on school. Which is an area where I have not worked directly, but I do currently have a friend working as a school counselor in a high school. So I want to encourage people, if you're having questions that the material isn't answering about this work, and if these are not sort of Googleable questions, I highly encourage you to include those in your discussion posts. Just kind of let me know that that's what that question is, and I can see if she might be able to answer some of those. Again, I've heard her talk about work. I know she's a busy gal, so please do try to keep them specific to things that can't be answered by Google. Otherwise, I might sort of redirect you to try to find the answer yourself first, and then if we can always go back and forth if you can't find it, but want to be respectful of everyone's time. So this chapter, I think, actually does a really nice job digging into some of the specifics of the different types of roles that we'll encounter in schools, the different types of work that those roles sort of take ownership of versus the responsibilities that they share, and how those roles work together. There are only a few things I want to highlight this week more specifically, and I really will defer you largely to the material this week. But just to break down a few things with a bit more of my own thoughts and context before we move forward. So the reason that I think it's actually great that we're focusing on school initially before we move out to sort of a broader look at adolescence is because this is really the main access point for a lot of kids to engage with any sort of supportive services like this, especially on a one-on-one basis. A lot of kiddos who have heightened medical needs or heightened behavioral needs where they have an individualized education plan or an IEP or a 504 plan, which is similar but pertains a little bit more to accommodations as opposed to specific services. For kiddos with these kinds of plans, this is sort of a one-stop shop for them to access physical therapy, occupational therapy, speech therapy, counseling. It can really be a one-stop shop for these kids to access services that might be pretty high barrier services outside of the school environment. So I think the focus on school actually does make a lot of sense. The chapter really focuses on that adolescent period, so I would say middle school and high school, but it's worth noting that if you're interested in this work, you can be a school counselor, a school social worker, from elementary school through college. There are absolutely roles outside of the adolescent period. If teenagers aren't your jam, that's totally understandable, and definitely just something to keep in mind. One other reason that I think school-based services are a really nice place for young people to start is because there's the potential for some stigma reduction. If you think about, let's say you're 13 years old and you're feeling a lot of feelings that are new to you, your mood is low and you know you're struggling, being able to say, oh, I'm going to go see the school counselor could just mean you're going to talk about your grades. It could just mean you're going to talk about your classes for next quarter, or it could mean that you're struggling and you need to talk to someone. And not only do you just have to walk right down the hall as opposed to calling an office, making an appointment, figuring out how insurance works, but you can also sort of put up a little bit of a wall if you wanted to between what's going on with you and what the outside world sees. So I think that's another really lovely reason that we love school counselors, and we love when schools can embed some of these services within an environment where kids are already spending a lot of time. More broadly, I did want to make sure we touched on confidentiality for adolescents. So for the purpose of this specific part of the lecture, we're really focusing on kids 13 and up. I will include a link to a grid from the University of Washington that really clearly lays out what kind of healthcare, mental health care, substance use care, folks can access based on their age without any parental consent. This is really important and something, if you're going to be working with preteens and teens, you are going to have to talk about this a lot. Sometimes that conversation is going to go really well. Sometimes parents, guardians, caregivers are not going to like that. But really, when we break it down, the goal behind giving 13 and up year old kids increased ownership over how they access resources and the confidentiality that they deserve when they're engaging with those resources is really to get them to engage. Think back to when you were 13 years old. If you had to go to every counseling session with your mom sitting right there, or let's say you wanted to go talk to someone about birth control and your grandpa was sitting right there, it would potentially really inhibit your willingness to engage with those services. So it's definitely, it can be a point of contention between some youth and their caregivers. Some caregivers totally get it and don't really have an issue with it, but it's definitely a conversation that you are probably going to have many times if you're doing this work. In that same vein, I do want to briefly touch on sort of when that isn't the case. So these are likely concepts that people are sort of peripherally aware of. This idea of when someone is hospitalized or put into treatment sort of without their consent. We think about this for people who are severely mentally ill, can't keep themselves safe, can't keep themselves taken care of. But we can also extend this into the substance use realm as well. This, if I'm not mistaken, is a newer part of this. So Ricky's Law, which I will also include a link for in probably the extra information at the end of the module, is a recent piece of legislation specific to Washington State that says that not only can, regardless of someone's age, can they be hospitalized against their will for mental health, but that this can also be done for substance use. From a sort of real life practice standpoint, I will say, at least in my experience, the part of Ricky's Law that pertains to substance use is really tricky to actually enforce for youth. I can't speak for what this looks like for adults, but for youth, there are very few, if any, facilities that are willing to take a youth for substance use treatment if they don't want to be there. So you might be able to make the case for that child needing that level of support, but it's unlikely that you would find a bed that would take someone, even if they're 13, 14, 15 years old, if they don't want to be there. So just a piece of legislation and a general concept I wanted to point out. I don't think that's anywhere in a quiz or anything like that, but it's important to keep that in mind when you're thinking about this sort of middle childhood age where you're still very much legally a child, but your brain is functioning very differently than that of a 6 or 7-year-old. And rights are changing, access to services is changing. The last thing I just want to touch on quickly, and again, I think the textbook does a pretty good job of getting into this, is the internet. I can't speak for the rest of the folks in this room, but when I was an adolescent, we were really just getting comfortable with the internet. Chat rooms were about as scary as it got from sort of an adult perspective, watching preteens and teens engage with this. I think this is an area where our field has a lot of catching up to do. The plethora of things that can be complicated by the internet, I think we just haven't even scratched the surface. You know, we've talked about cyberbullying. We talk about exploitation of minors through the internet. We talk about the impact that social media has on young people and their mental health, and really everyone in their mental health. I think our field has a lot of catching up to do, and I hope that it's an area where we see education and sort of a teaching of a critical way to engage with this resource. I hope we see that grow and get stronger, but I don't personally think we're there yet, and I'd be interested to hear what you all have to say as well. I think that's where I'm going to leave it for this week. Again, this is an age group that I work with quite regularly, but it's not a setting where I've worked. So do let me know if you have questions about school-based counseling, social work, all of that. You can include those in your discussion board posts, and I will let you get on with the rest of the module.